Hi, I'm Emma. She read his messages. Was she wrong? Let's get into it. The moment I found the second phone, my entire world didn't just crack, it shattered into a million invisible shards that cut deeper than any broken glass ever could. I was standing in the hallway of our apartment, the morning light filtering through the blinds, dust motes dancing in the air, looking for my car keys. Instead, I found a sleek, black device that wasn't mine, tucked deep inside the lining of a coat I hadn't worn since winter. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I swiped the screen. It was locked, but a notification blinked from the top. Hey, I can't wait to see you tonight. From a contact saved simply as M. I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle the scream that was clawing its way up my throat. I wasn't just looking at a phone, I was looking at a stranger living a life alongside mine, a life built on a foundation of sand that had turned to water the second I made that connection. I sat down on the floor, the cold hardwood seeping through my pajamas, and waited for the sun to rise on a marriage that was already dead. But this relationship didn't end in a single moment. It ended slowly, over time, eroding like a coastline during a slow tide. And to understand how we got here, to understand why I am sitting here in silence while the person I love most in the world is currently lying in the other room, you need to know how it began. Elias and I met at a coffee shop in the downtown district, a place where the air always smelled of roasted beans and rainy pavement. We were both 22, fresh out of college, and completely desperate to find our footing in a world that felt too big and too loud. He was the kind of man who remembered your coffee order before you even sat down, the kind of man who could talk for hours about his love for vintage film cameras and the intricate details of architectural history. When he smiled at me that first morning, it felt like the sun had finally broken through a week of gray clouds. We fell in love with a speed and intensity that felt dangerous to our friends, a whirlwind of late-night drives, shared playlists, and promises that we would never change. The early days were a blur of golden hours and whispered secrets. He was my rock, my confidant, and my safest place. I remember the night we decided to move in together. The box of his things was stacked by the door, and he looked at me with such fierce devotion that I thought, this is it. This is the person I will grow old with. But even in the golden haze of those first 2 years, there were small signs, tiny fissures in the porcelain that I was too in love to notice. It started with his phone. He would flip it face down on the table when we were on dates, claiming he was giving us quality time without distractions. But I began to see him checking it constantly when he went to the bathroom, the screen lighting up his face with a mixture of guilt and excitement that I misinterpreted as work stress. He started working later and later, citing a big project at his firm, but his eyes would lose that sharp focus when I asked for details, replaced by a vague, placating smile. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just insecure because of my own family's history of infidelity. I chose to ignore the way he started dressing differently, the new cologne that wasn't his usual scent, and the way he seemed to disappear into his own head more often than not. I told myself that love was about giving people space, about trusting them, and so I swallowed the rising unease in my chest, convinced that the man I was marrying was the same man I had fallen for, just a little more stressed than usual. As the months turned into a year, the cracks began to widen, transforming from invisible hairlines into deep, jagged chasms that we refused to acknowledge. The arguments started over trivial things, like leaving dishes in the sink or forgetting to buy milk, but they were never really about the dishes. They were about the distance. I would try to talk to him about our future, about the wedding date we had set, and he would deflect with a joke or a sudden need to check his email. I remember one specific night, 3 months after we moved in, where I had planned a surprise anniversary dinner. I had cooked his favorite meal, the lighting was perfect, and I had saved up for months for a gift I knew he wanted. When he walked through the door, he looked exhausted, but when I mentioned the dinner, he sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to deflate the room. He told me he had a mandatory overtime at the office that he couldn't get out of, again. He went to work, and I sat alone at the table for 4 hours, eating cold pasta, watching the clock tick by. When he came back at 1 a.m., he kissed my forehead, apologized, and fell asleep instantly, snoring within minutes. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling like a stranger in my own life. That night was the first time I almost left. I packed a bag, stood in the hallway with my feet over the door, and then put it back down. I rationalized it. I told myself he was just under immense pressure at his new job, that he was stressed, that he was just going through a phase. I told myself that if I was patient, if I gave him space, he would come back to me. I made a mental list of things to stop doing: stop asking about his day, stop planning surprises, stop needing him emotionally. I convinced myself that this quiet, distant version of Elias was the price of a stable marriage. I told myself that love meant sacrifice, and that my sacrifice of my own needs was the ultimate act of devotion. But every time he came home late, every time he lied about his location, every time he looked at me with eyes that had already looked away, that hope was the rope that kept me tied to a sinking ship. I told myself he would change, that the man I met at the coffee shop was still in there, buried under layers of work stress and bad habits. I ignored the way he stopped introducing me to his colleagues, the way he started keeping his phone on him at all times, even in the shower. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was the one with the issues, not him. I convinced myself that the love we had was strong enough to survive anything, even the slow, agonizing erosion of trust that was happening right under my nose. The betrayal didn't happen in a burst of anger. It was a calculated, years-long deception that unraveled only when I finally stopped looking away. Elias had been seeing a woman named Sarah, a graphic designer he had met at a client meeting 8 months before we got engaged. She wasn't a stranger, she was someone he had been planning his future with in secret, someone he had been building a life parallel to ours. The affair wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a deep intimacy that I had assumed was reserved for us. For 6 months, Elias had been lying to my face, telling me he was at the office when he was actually having dinner with her, watching movies in her apartment, or just sitting in her car talking about how unhappy he was with work stress and pressure from his family. He had been using the credit card we shared for joint expenses to pay for hotel rooms, for gifts for Sarah, and for a subscription service she liked. I found out when I pulled the statement for a surprise birthday gift I was buying myself, trying to find a small transaction I had missed. The amount didn't make sense, and the merchant name was a hotel chain we had never stayed at. My hands shook as I called the number on the back of the card, and then I called the hotel directly, pretending to be a concerned spouse checking on a booking. They gave me the reservation details: a double room, checked in under my name, but the second guest's ID was different. It was Sarah. The date on the receipt was a Tuesday, the night Elias had told me he was staying at the office to finish a report. I spent the next hour scrolling through his social media, finding the photos he had deleted, the likes he had left on her posts, the comments where he called her his soulmate. I realized then that this wasn't a slip-up, it was a double life. For 6 months, he had been living a completely separate existence, loving another woman while holding my hand, promising me a future, and sleeping in the same bed I shared. When I finally confronted him, he didn't deny it. He looked at me with a look of such profound defeat that it was worse than anger. He admitted to everything: the dates, the lies, the money, the other woman. He told me he had been feeling unfulfilled, that he felt like he was losing himself in the routine of our life, and that Sarah made him feel alive again. He cried, he begged, he said he made a mistake, that he loved me more than anything, that he could leave her and come back. But the damage was done. The trust was gone. The man I thought I knew was a stranger who had been stealing from me, lying to me, and loving someone else while I was planning a wedding. The betrayal was so total, so comprehensive, that it made the years of love feel like a lie. The weeks that followed the discovery were a blur of emotional chaos and physical exhaustion. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to break everything in the apartment, but I was too numb. I went to my mother first, sobbing into her phone, and she was horrified, telling me to leave immediately, to never speak to him again. Then I went to my best friend, who tried to be the voice of reason, reminding me of the good times, suggesting we go to couples counseling, suggesting that maybe we could work through this if he was truly sorry. But then came the moment that broke me. I went to a mutual friend, someone we both considered a bridge between our worlds, and asked for their opinion on how to handle it. They told me, with a shrug, that maybe I was being too harsh, that men make mistakes, and that I should let it go for the sake of the relationship. They told me I was overreacting, that everyone goes through a rough patch, and that I should focus on the big picture of our years together. That was the loneliest moment of my life. I sat in my car, listening to their voice on the phone, realizing that no one truly understood what it felt like to have your reality dismantled, to have your trust shattered by the person who was supposed to be your anchor. I felt isolated, surrounded by people who were trying to fix a problem that couldn't be fixed, who were trying to minimize my pain because it was too uncomfortable for them to witness. I went home that night and found Elias sleeping on the couch, a pillow over his face, pretending to be asleep. I looked at him, the man I had loved for 5 years, and I realized that the person I had loved was a fiction. I realized that the betrayal hadn't ended the night I found the phone. The betrayal was the weeks of silence that followed, the way he looked at me with a mixture of pity and desperation, the way he tried to explain his actions with words that felt like cold water on a burning fire. I knew then that it was over. Not because he was gone, but because I was gone. I couldn't be the person I was before, and he couldn't be the person he needed to be to make me feel safe again. The rage eventually came, a hot, burning anger that consumed me, but it didn't bring me back. It just confirmed what I already knew. We tried, for a few weeks, to talk, to plan, to heal. We went to therapy, we wrote letters, we made lists of things to change. But every time I looked at him, I saw the phone, the lies, the other woman. Every time he spoke, I heard the excuses. The spiral wasn't a fall, it was a slow, agonizing drift into a place where we were just two strangers sharing a roof. I realized that the only way to survive this was to let go, to stop trying to rebuild a house on a foundation that was now just a pile of dust. To understand the full weight of this tragedy, we have to look at both sides of the story, not to excuse the behavior, but to understand the human complexity of failure. On one side, I am the betrayed, the woman who gave everything and was met with a hollowed-out existence. I missed the signs because I wanted to believe in the love we had. I chose to ignore the red flags because the idea of losing him was more painful than the truth of his betrayal. I rationalized his absences, his phone secrecy, his emotional distance because I was terrified of being alone. I told myself that I was the problem, that I was too demanding, too needy, that if I had just been a better partner, he wouldn't have looked elsewhere. I carried the weight of his infidelity as if it was my fault, as if my love was insufficient to keep him faithful. But on the other side, Elias is a man who was lost, who felt invisible in his own life. He told himself that he was just searching for something he had lost, that he was looking for a spark, a feeling of being alive that he couldn't find in the routine of our marriage. He justified his actions by telling himself that he wasn't hurting anyone, that he loved me, that he was just trying to find himself. He convinced himself that the affair was a necessary escape, a way to feel whole again before he could come back to me. He saw himself as a victim of his own unhappiness, a man who made a mistake because he was weak and confused. He felt guilty, but he also felt a strange sense of relief in finally being honest, even if it destroyed us. Neither of us was purely evil, both of us were flawed, scared, and human. I was blind to the truth because I wanted it to be real. He was deceitful because he was afraid of facing the void in his own heart. We both failed each other in different ways, but one failure was active, and the other was passive. One was a betrayal of trust, and the other was a betrayal of the self. And in the end, that difference was the one thing that could never be reconciled. So, where does that leave us? Is this a story of a man who was purely guilty, who chose a secret life over a committed relationship? Or is the situation more complicated than a simple case of bad behavior? On one hand, Elias made a conscious choice to deceive his partner, to steal money, to build a lie on top of a lie. That is a choice that cannot be undone. He had the opportunity to end things, to be honest, to let me go, but he chose to keep me in the dark. That is a betrayal that makes him guilty in the eyes of the law and the eyes of morality. On the other hand, the relationship had been deteriorating for years. I had ignored the signs, I had tolerated the distance, and I had allowed the dynamic to become unhealthy. Was I responsible for the environment that allowed this to happen? Did my silence and my refusal to confront the early signs contribute to the distance that led him astray? There is a middle ground, a gray area where we both failed. I failed to see the truth because I was afraid of it. He failed to communicate his unhappiness because he was afraid of the consequence. But does that make the betrayal less terrible? No. Does it make me less hurt? No. But it makes the story more human, more tragic. It shows that love is not a shield against our own flaws, and that sometimes, even the best intentions can lead to the worst outcomes. So, guilty or not? Love, lies, and hard choices. You decide. Was Elias purely guilty for the deception, or was the relationship so broken before the affair that the betrayal was inevitable? Was I blameless, or did my silence play a part in the tragedy? These are the questions that keep us up at night, the questions that don't have easy answers. I want to hear from you, because I know that stories like this don't just happen in the world of fiction. I know that many of you have been in a situation where trust was broken, where you had to decide if a relationship could survive the unforgivable. What is your verdict? Was Elias guilty, or was there a gray area that made him a victim of his own unhappiness? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between the love of your life and the truth? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I want to know what you think. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships or the people you love, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We have so many more stories coming, stories of betrayal, of forgiveness, of the difficult choices we all have to make. Next week, we'll be talking about a different kind of betrayal, one that involves a secret from the past that threatens to destroy a new beginning. You don't want to miss that one. Until then, take care of yourselves, and remember that sometimes, the hardest part of a relationship isn't the betrayal, but the decision of what to do next.